In this tutorial, I'm going to talk about frequency shifters, ring modulators, and how we can create our own frequency shifter without actually using a frequency shifter plugin. If I load up frequency shifter on this saw wave here, and the frequency shifter has this fine or coarse control, and it displays a value in hertz. You can go positive or negative. What a frequency shifter does is it will take the spectrum of any given signal and it will shift it up or down a specified number of hertz. Now, this is different than a pitch shifter. A pitch shifter is basically a harmonic multiplier. It multiplies all of the harmonic frequencies in the spectrum by a factor of a certain amount. So by a factor of 2 would transpose everything up an octave. It will essentially pitch shift it up an octave. Multiplying all of the frequencies by 0.5 will transpose it down an octave. Multiplying it by 4 will shift it up 2 octaves. Multiplying it by 0.25 will shift it down 2 octaves. A pitch shifter will retain the harmonic relationship between the harmonic partials and therefore will preserve a consonant sounding pitch, whereas a frequency shifter, on the other hand, does not do that. A frequency shifter is merely a harmonic adder or subtractor. If I play C, all of these harmonics, they are multiples of the fundamental frequency. And that's what gives it a very consistent consonant sounding tone or note. But if I use a frequency shifter to, say, add 100 hertz to the entire signal, it will essentially shift the spectrum up 100 hertz. It will add 100 hertz to every single harmonic frequency that you see. And if I play the note, you'll notice this doesn't have the same quality of tone that it did before. And the reason being is because it breaks the harmonic relationship of these harmonic partials when you start adding frequencies to all of the partials in the spectrum. So a frequency shifter essentially does not preserve the harmonic relationship of your harmonics. Now, this is a really unique effect. You can get some really cool dissonant inharmonic tones out of frequency shifters. Another cool thing about them is that they do not introduce latency. They are actually analog effects. They can be created with simple electronic components in the real world, and they are not digital effects, essentially. I want to talk about ring modulation. There is a plugin by Kilohertz called Ring Mod, and if I play a note, you'll hear that it sounds very kind of rough and dissonant. It has a frequency control. If I change the frequency, as you can hear, it has similar qualities as the frequency shifter. However, it's much rougher sounding, and it's a lot messier. So let's see what's happening with the ring mod. If I set my input signal, I'm going to call the input signal, the input audio that I'm putting into the ring mod, the carrier. If I make my carrier a sine wave and I change my modulator frequency, the frequency that the carrier is being modulated by is called the modulator. And in this case, I can control it in this plugin. I can control it between, switch between 10 hertz all the way up to about 10,000 hertz. You get that type of effect. Now, what's actually happening with the ring mod is this is, in a way, similar to amplitude modulation. Now, what is happening with amplitude modulation is if you have a carrier frequency, an amplitude modulator will change the amplitude or the gain or the loudness of the signal between its full range and silence at a specified frequency. And a ring modulator is similar. If I set the mix of the ring mod to 50%, it will actually be a amplitude modulator. So if I play a higher note on my carrier, you can hear this wobbling effect, and my frequency is set to 10 hertz. So what is actually happening is this carrier is being amplitude modulated by 10 hertz. So it is going from zero volume or silence to the full signal 10 times per second. And if I increase this frequency, it will increase that speed, that rate of volume fluctuation, until you go high enough to where it starts creating its own tones. If we look at our oscilloscope here, we can see what's actually happening. If I turn the ring mod off, I have this single sine wave. When I enable the ring mod, you can see that there are gaps of silence. And you can see that the way that it is amplitude modulating is also a sine wave. The modulator in this case is a sine oscillator. This can be different types of waveforms, but a sine oscillator is the cleanest, and it's what we're going to use in this case. So if I increase the frequency or decrease the frequency, you can see that it changes the frequency of amplitude modulation. I can change my carrier frequency, and my modulator frequency stays the same, and you can see that the gaps of silence stay in the same place. Now, if I increase the mix all the way up, what you'll see is that it is doubling the amount of waves. What's actually happening when we have it at 50%, between each wave is silent. But as we go above 50%, what's actually happening is it is taking the carrier, and every time the modulator goes below 0, it is inverting the polarity of the carrier wave. If the modulator's amplitude is 0, then the carrier will not play through. If the modulator's amplitude is +1 or 0 dB, then the carrier will play straight through as if it's not being affected. But if the modulator's amplitude is in the negatives, then it will invert the carrier's polarity at the amplitude that the modulator's amplitude is. So what we can see on the spectrum here, the actual practical effect of that, what we actually hear when we start increasing the frequency of the modulator on a ring mod, so you can see it is taking that sine wave signal, in this case playing C, it's about 532 hertz. As I start increasing the frequency of this ring mod, you'll see that there is a frequency deviation that goes above and below where the carrier's frequency was. The amount that it is being shifted above and below is the same amount of hertz that the modulator is tuned to. So if we tune the modulator to 100 hertz, it is creating a frequency shift of the carrier up 100 hertz and below 100 hertz from the carrier's original frequency. These deviations here are called sidebands. Now, something that you'll notice is when we increase the modulator's frequency high enough to where the lower sideband hits 0 hertz, and then we continue to go higher, it will reflect, it will wrap around, and it will start to bend both of these sidebands higher and higher. So as you can see, this is already kind of similar to a frequency shifter. However, if I actually use a frequency shifter, you'll see so if I shift this up 500 hertz, and if I shift the ring mod up 500 hertz, you'll see that the top sideband, the upper sideband, is doing the exact same thing as the frequency shifter is. Now, really all a frequency shifter is a ring modulator that has its lower sideband removed or canceled. And we can actually recreate a frequency shifter by understanding this phenomenon. We can recreate a frequency shifter by utilizing a ring mod, as well as some other components. So if we look at the schematic, the circuit diagram for a frequency shifter, there's a couple things going on. So we have the input signal here. It goes in and it is split into two parallel signals, and then they go through these phase shifters, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then they go into these things called multipliers. Now, these multipliers are the same thing as the ring mod. The multipliers are just ring modulators. That's what they do. They multiply the carrier's amplitude with the modulator's amplitude. So if the modulator is 0, then the carrier's amplitude is always going to be 0. If the modulator's amplitude is +1, then it's going to be the same signal unaffected. But if the ring modulator's amplitude goes to -1, then it will be the same signal it'll be the same carrier signal, the same input signal, but the polarity will be inverted. So any positive amplitude on the carrier multiplied by -1 will be the negative, will be the inverse of that. It will be a negative value of whatever the positive value is of the carrier, and vice versa. If the carrier's amplitude is negative and the modulator's amplitude is negative, then they will be multiplied together, and it will create a product of a positive value. So mathematically, now you can understand why the ring mod is also called a multiplier here. But what is happening in this center part, in this circuit diagram, it is using a 5 Hertz sine and cosine wave. It really can be any frequency that you want. But the important thing is the sine and cosine relationship. This is, they call this a quadrature oscillator. And a quadrature oscillator really is two signals of the same frequency, but phase shifted 90 degrees apart from each other. And then these signals are summed back together and then outputted. Now, the tricky part in creating this is the phase shift in the beginning. So the phase shift, 45 degrees in positive direction, 45 degrees in the negative direction. And how we can create that is what is called a Hilbert transformer. Now, a Hilbert transformer, what it is able to do is rotate all of the phases of all of the frequencies in that signal by 90 degrees. Conveniently, Kilohertz has a plugin called phase distortion that allows you to do this. It has this Hilbert transformer built into it. Because of that, we are able to faithfully create the effect of a frequency shifter using ring mods and the phase distortion plugin. So this Kilohertz plugin, SnapHeap, is a plugin host for all of the other Kilohertz plugins that exist. And the convenient thing about this is we have multiple lanes. We have 4 lanes that we can arrange either in series as serial buses, or by clicking this down here, parallel lanes or parallel buses. And that's very convenient because in this circuit diagram, we will need to create a parallel chain in order to split the signal up into 2 separate signals to process them separately. First of all, I think the easiest part of this is going to be creating the quadrature oscillator here, and that's known as the modulator. This is going to be the modulator, which is going to modulate the carrier signal or the input signal. I'm going to use what we have right here, And I'm just going to delete all this stuff over here. Really, all we need to do is create a quadrature signal from this sine wave. So I'm going to bypass snap heap for now. And I'm going to load up the kilohertz phase distortion. So the kilohertz phase distortion plugin, we're not actually going to be using it for its for what it was intended to be used for. So in this case, I'm going to just turn the drive, normalize, and tone knobs all the way to 0. I'm going to keep the mix knob all the way up. What I'm interested in is the spread knob, and as you can see, the vague description here says spreads phase offset for left and right channels. Now, it's not that descriptive, but what I discovered is when you increase this all the way to its maximum value, it is going to offset the left and right channels by 90 degrees, or positive 45 and negative 45 degrees from each other, from what their original phases were. Now, this is really all we need to do to create a quadrature signal. If we use an oscilloscope, or a vector scope rather, I'm going to use Signalizer. So if I turn the spread all the way off, if I play a note, you're going to see this line that appears here. It is a combination of the left channel and the right channel summing together and creating a mono signal. So if I pan this left and right, let me use a utility to pan this left and right, you will see how the vector scope responds. So if I pan this left, only the left channel is coming through, and this diagonal axis going from the top left to the bottom right is representing the left channel's input. And if I bring the balance from left to right, this diagonal from the bottom left to the top right is the right signal. Now, if I disable this, or if I delete that and increase the spread amount on the phase distortion, it's going to offset all of the frequencies. It's going to offset the phases of all of the frequencies by 90 degrees by shifting the left and right channel 45 degrees apart from each other. So it pretty much gives us a perfectly round signal. I could play multiple notes. As we get much lower in the frequency spectrum, it does start to break down a little bit. But as you can see, almost all of these frequencies are 90 degrees phase shifted from each other in the left and right channel, or in quadrature phase. You may be thinking, well, can't you just use a delay to offset the signal to create that quadrature phase, have them 90 degrees apart from each other? The answer is yes, but only for specific frequencies. And I will demonstrate that now. If I use a delay and say I just create a Haas delay, really just offsetting the left and right channels by a very small amount, I'm just going to turn off the filter and ping pong. I have a mono signal, and if I delay the right side just slightly, you'll see that I can create a quadrature signal. However, if I play different frequencies, you'll notice that some are mono and some are antiphase. So it only works for some frequencies. However, what we need is, instead of a delay, we need the phase shifter, also known as a Hilbert transformer, also known as a quadrature generator, that is found within the phase distortion plugin, known as the spread parameter. So all of these things are the same, just different words to describe the same thing that is happening here. So this is not doing this by utilizing a delay. It is phase shifting by actually using all pass filters in different positions to create this phase shifting that is in quadrature from the left and right channel. So we can play all these different notes, and they will be phase shifted 90 degrees apart from each other. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, let's reference our schematic again. We have this quadrature oscillator completed. So this part is done. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine the phase distortion and the wavetable. I'm going to group them together. And this chain I'm going to rename modulator. So we created the quadrature oscillator, and that's going to be the modulator. Now, for the carrier, I'm going to use snap heap. So I'm just going to drag this empty snap heap into a new chain, and I'm going to call this carrier. Now, let's open up the snap heap, and let's see how we can create this schematic. We're going to have to split the signal into parallel, and then introduce 45-degree complementary phase shifts. So positive 45 degrees in one, and then negative 45 degrees in the other. So I created a parallel bus by clicking this down here. So now it basically takes the incoming signal and then splits it into two parallel chains. And what we're going to do is I'm going to use phase distortion. And I'm just going to set it up in the same way that I did to create our quadrature oscillator for our modulator. I'm going to turn the spread all the way up, and I'm going to do the same thing over here. Now, what's happening is this is taking a mono signal and making it a stereo signal. It is creating a left and right split, and it is changing the relationships of the left and right split. Now, what we need to do, instead of keeping them left in the left channel and the right channel, we need to make both of these, we need to collapse both of these to mono. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a stereo effect. I'm going to bring this above the phase distortion. And I'm going to pan this left and then copy this over by holding Alt, and then pan this right. So now we have only the left channel of our input, of our carrier, going into the phase distortion, and only the right channel going into the other phase distortion. And then what we're going to do again is duplicate the stereo effect one more time. I'm going to reset the pan to the center, and I'm going to set the width to 0. And I'm going to copy this over to the other parallel chain. Now, what this is doing is this is creating mono signals for the left and right channel of our carrier input. That way they can be processed they can be processed by the phase distortion as if they were mono signals, thus preserving the stereo quality of our input. So then what we need to do is we need to apply the ring modulators. Yeah, I'm going to add ring mods to both of these. So instead of using the built-in sine oscillator, we're going to use the external. We're going to set these to external. And what that's going to do is it's going to use the sidechain input of the snap heap as our modulator source. So what I'm going to do now is set my sidechain input to the track that we're on, this instrument rack, and then I'm going to assign that to the modulator chain in this instrument rack here, post effects. It needs to be post effects, not pre-effects and not post mixer. It needs to be post effects because we want it to be affected by the phase shift in our phase distortion. And then what we're going to want to do is just mute this chain. If we have our sidechain input set to post mixer, if I play a note, as you can see, it's grayed out. It's not going to get signal. So it needs to be post effects so that when we mute the modulator, because we don't want to hear the modulator signal, we just want to hear the carrier signal being affected. So when we mute the modulator, our sidechain input is not silent. Okay, so now this modulator signal that we have from the wavetable that is being phase shifted in quadrature by the phase distortion is now what is being used as our modulator signals for our ring mods inside of our left and right parallel buses here. And then the last thing that we need to do is just pan our outputs left and right respectively. Together, we get a left and right channel signal. One last step. As you can hear, this is stereo image, sounds very strange, doesn't sound quite right. We need to apply another stereo effect here and make these outputs completely mono. So now, if I change the frequency of the modulator signal, we should have a frequency shifter. So right now what's actually happening is the frequency shift is going in the negative direction, and we can remedy that by just using a utility and putting it on the modulator, and then just flipping the polarity of one of the channels. There we go. Now we effectively get that lower sideband cancellation from these this quadrature signal from the phase distortion in the modulator, and then the plus 45 and minus 45 phase shifts with the phase distortions in our carrier signals chain. Now, we've effectively created a frequency shifter. Now, the really cool thing about this is an instrument rack. So you can use any waveform you like for the modulator, as well as any waveform or any instrument, or even a sample using a sampler that you'd like with the carrier, and any note that you play will be key-tracked. The modulator, the frequency shift, will be key-tracked to whatever note that you're playing, as will the carrier. So let's try something cool. I'm going to set this to a square wave. I'm gonna enable unison so we can hear that nice stereo sound. And then I can mess with the transpose on here. It's important to note that this is only a monophonic effect, so we can't do chords unless you want a very nasty distorted sound. So I'm just going to set these to mono. So if I bypass this snap heap, which is the frequency shifter, for one, it's going to be very loud. Now, the reason why there is a gain difference and how we can compensate for that is because the modulator needs to have its volume output be 0 dB. That way, when they multiply together, we get a signal that is not being turned down by the modulator. It is still a little bit quieter, however, we can compensate for that just by turning up the gain. Cool. All right, so here's something cool that we can do. If we go into our carrier, we can actually put this snap heap into its own chain and have a dry signal come through. And when you combine the dry signal with a frequency shifted signal, as you may know, it can create that infinite phaser effect. But when it's in tune, when the modulator and carrier are key-tracked with each other, we can actually transpose that phaser effect. And get that really cool, nice, thick sound. So that's really cool. Let's take this a step further. Let's see what happens when we change the modulator from a sine wave to, let's set it to classic, and then let's do some hard sync. Let's shift this up an octave. And let's bypass the dry chain. Let's set the carry to a saw wave. And we can even take this a step further. If we use something like Serum, it'll be a little bit easier to visualize and have more control over this. So let's just do basic shapes and use the sine wave. And this is the modulator signal. I'm going to turn the level all the way up. And let's set this to sync window half. So what's happening now is we're creating a frequency shifting effect, but it is not dissonant. It doesn't create inharmonic overtones. And the reason why is because we're using a windowed sync, which doesn't have any inharmonic overtones. Yet we can still transpose the frequency of it, but because it's windowed, we don't introduce any dissonance. So for instance, if I increase the coarse pitch, it does the frequency shifter effect, but dissonance appears. And when we use the windowed sync, you get a similar effect, but there's no dissonance. If I turn the detune amount down even more, you can really hear the difference. This is a very stable sound. Coarse pitch. You can hear that there's dissonance because some intervals there's that warbling effect. Now, again, if we use the sync, no dissonance. I can also increase the modulator by a few octaves. It's a very cool effect. So now that we've created this, let's try this with a more complex sounding carrier. Let's try something like Razor. And let me just reset this. So instead of using a saw wave, let's use primes. Increase the random, introduce some stereo spread. And now let's frequency shift this. also going to set this to mono and legato. We can also use different waveforms as the modulator. So I could use triangle wave. I could use a square wave. Saw wave. Very cool. Now let's try this with something like a natural instrument, like let's try it with a piano. I'm going to increase the release time so we can get that natural piano decay. Keytracked frequency shifter. Now, if I flip off this utility, instead of it shifting upwards, it's going to shift downwards. But we're going to have some sideband. We're going to have that sideband wrap around after it hits 0 and start bending back up. So let's just hear how that sounds. It's almost like a format shifter. It's very cool. Let's try some higher octaves.
Squarified piano. And then we'll have the utility so that we get positive shift. So there you have it, a tunable, key trackable frequency shifter.